Going from London to Edinburgh today is quite a simple affair. You can get on a train at King's Cross, relax and even enjoy a meal or two, and then get off in Edinburgh fully refreshed. The fastest route taking around 4.5 hours. But 100 years ago, things were not that simple. The Big Four had just emerged, and the journey time between the both cities was around about 8.5 hours. Between 1862, when the first service ran, and then, about 2 hours had been slashed from the time. That might seem a lot, but with the introduction of dining cars and corridor coaches allowing the passengers more movement, most of the time saved was in reducing the stopping time at stations. Thanks to valve gear modifications, the new A1 and A3 classes were more economical on coal, and it was estimated that just one tender full of coal was enough to take the train non-stop from London to Edinburgh. Water troughs along the main line allowed the engines to collect water on the go and were well established. There was really only one reason why the train had to stop: the train crew. While the engine was able to take the loads, the poor crew was not. Because of the tender, the train crew were effectively cut off from the rest of the train, and because of this, the train was forced to stop to change crews. If this was the only stop the train had to make, then it made it highly inefficient. The LNER had run non-stop passenger services before during the summer between Newcastle and London, and the passengers really enjoyed them. So the LNER wanted to schedule a new non-stop service from London to Edinburgh. The new A1s and A3s had tenders that held the required 8 tonnes of coal and around 5,000 gallons of water. The 8-wheeled tenders were called coal rail tenders on the account of the coal rails that ran around them, but the problem of the crew separation remained. In 1828, the LNER was in a position to introduce running non-stop from London to Edinburgh thanks to a breakthrough in tender design. The tender would still hold the required 5,000 gallons of water, but the tender now had a new hidden corridor which ran through it on the right-hand side. The tender corridor was tiny, only 18 inches across by only 5 foot high, but it was enough space to ferry the crew from the engine to a waiting coach. Surprisingly, despite the reduced space, the tender's capacity was increased by an extra tonne. The majority of the coal rails were removed and replaced with a curved top. At the back of the tender, the corridor door was centralised so it aligned with standard gangway doors on the coaches, and both foot brackets and handrails were installed, giving the crew access to the rear of the tender if required. To protect the crew travelling in the gangway, a small coal rail was placed over the door in case of any wayward pieces of coal as the train travelled at speed. On the 1st of May 1928, all was ready for the initial departure. The engine chosen for this inaugural run was none other than LNER poster child, Flying Scotsman. The distance was a sizable 393 miles each way, and if completed, a world record. The crew would change over around the halfway mark, and when not on the footplate, the crew could relax in a third-class compartment. The run went flawlessly, and the passengers loved it. In their wake, a further 10 corridor tenders were created, but despite their popularity and usefulness, as more engines rolled out of the works, they were not built with corridor tenders. Their tenders were similar, but just without the corridor. The corridor tenders eventually were destined for the P2 classes as well as the Raven Pacifics. Corridor tenders were revisited briefly, but it was in 1935 is where this tender shone. The new Streamlined A4 Pacifics were ready, and to not spoil the design, they were built with their own purpose-built corridor tender. The tender followed the streamlined contours of the engine, and the top was curved in. Over time, as the A4s took over the A3's work, the A3 tenders were swapped out with non-corridor versions and were remodelled. There are 22 corridor tenders produced, and quite remarkably, quite a few still survive. One of the tenders, number 5332, was converted into Flying Scotsman's second water tender by Pegler in the 60s after the withdrawal of steam and the removal of water towers and troughs. And some never stayed with one engine, like 5329, that was partnered with no less than 14 of them. And some, like 5484, that was specially designed as a one-off for the Hush Hush engine. At the National Railway Museum, although the museum houses Mallard, its tender is not corridor. Instead, it was fitted with a standard streamlined tender from the 60s, and Flying Scotsman lost its original tender after its run, but it didn't go far. In 1943, it was given to another preserved engine, Sir Nigel Gresley, and yes, that tender is still in active service. And of course, Scotsman got one again, and then the water tender in the 60s. If you really want to see a corridor tender up close, then actually there's no better time to do it. The NRM is housing the Flying Scotsman in its museum from now until the summer, until a new custodian is found to run her. Until then, she has actually been split from a tender, giving free access to the footplate, and you can see her free of charge and get up close to that tender and take a look down that corridor. It's a grand little design that took the railway companies further and faster, non-stop, than they ever really expected.